Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the incoming Brexit standards checks again. But instead of focusing on what's going to happen as a result of these checks, I'm actually going to ask, are they even going to take place? But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So we already have problems with trade with the EU. These snake oil salespeople and useful idiots are presenting a facade. Another haulage company is announcing that it's going to go bust because logistics is too challenging now for some operators. There is a limit as to how much you can increase operating costs for transporting goods before those goods no longer appeal to the customers. But up until a few days ago, all we had were customs controls and imports. No standards controls. They're being introduced this year, and things are set to get way worse. But how much worse? Although the government have published a plan to carry out SPS checks on lots of goods coming into the country, agri-food products, how do we know that they're actually going to be carried out? What if it's all just a scam? Now, in order for me to avoid sounding like a hysterical conspiracy theorist, let's consider what's actually happened when we introduced customs controls a year after leaving the customs union single market. In theory, everyone exporting to Britain has to complete customs paperwork, and there will be checks of goods to ensure compliance. Not all goods, of course, but a sufficient sample to make the risk for smugglers high enough to hit their profits. Only this isn't how it works in practice. The paperwork absolutely has to be completed, except when the system fails, at which point the UK authorities basically just wave everything through in order to avoid shortages on British shelves. But it's the checks which are very, very light touch. Back in 2021, HMRC confirmed to MPs that at the government's behest, they were prioritising traffic flow over customs checks. This was always the plan. It was in a paper by the National Audit Office at the end of 2020. Now, custom checks are supposed to be in proportion to the risk of smuggling. However, because this would slow down the flow of freight too much and we would have very noticeable shortages, we avoid customs checks if it means too much of a delay, which basically means they only happen when the traffic's not too busy. This is why smugglers are raking it in from Brexit. I imagine they don't send that much across in January and then just basically send lorry loads through in like September, October. In fact, our Treasury is losing way more money from lost import duties as a result of this than it ever costs to be members of the EU. I think that might be why Brexiteers have stopped talking about the cost of membership of late. And this tweet tells an all too familiar story for HGV drivers. So they describe being diverted for customs checks to the Severnton facility. Now, for reference, this is 22 miles away from the port at Dover. Oh, don't they have the checks at Dover? No, there's no room at Dover, you see. You can't build in the sea. So they have to have an inland facility. And these people spent 5 hours being diverted and held, at which point the staff there said, look, we can't carry out all these checks. You're just going to have to go. So the checks didn't take place, although they still had a 5-hour delay on their journey. This is what's happening right now. At this point, I want you to consider that standards checks have not begun. I know there's a lot of people keep talking as if they have. They haven't. They've heard that standards controls have begun and assumed this means checks. No. Standards controls are coming in 3 phases. The first phase, which began last week, means health certificates are required, but that's it. The next phase at the end of April is some checks are beginning, not very many. The final phase is at the end of October when all checks that are going to happen are supposed to happen. Absolutely devastating for our trade flow. This is why people, myself included, have warned of shortages in the shops. However, there are a couple of caveats to this. First, we don't actually have the capacity to carry out these checks. Dover's too small, which is why they have checking facilities 22 miles away further inland. I mean, here is a case of the existing staff not being able to keep on top of customs checks. Now, if the facilities can't manage customs checks, how is it going to manage when it has to do customs and standards checks? It's simple. They can't. Second, no government, doesn't matter if it's Conservative or Labour, no government really wants the sort of shortages that would result from prioritising checks over traffic flow. So just as has provably happened with customs checks, I think it's fair to say that authorities will prioritise traffic flow over checks for standards as well. Consider that Jacob Rees-Mogg, when he was the minister in charge, in 2022 described standards checks as an act of self-harm. Except, of course, we don't have the checks. Then we run an unacceptable high risk of importing a dangerous animal disease which badly affects our own food production. Farmers would not be best pleased. That is also an act of self-harm. So what to do? Well, if you pretend to implement standards controls, that is, you have a published regime of checks, but you tell officials to prioritise flow of traffic over checks. That means you will only ever have a reasonable level of checks at times of quiet trade flow, like January, February time. But once trade is really ramping up over late summer and autumn, most things are just going to get waved through because you can't keep up. In other words, the government essentially pays lip service to checks. It does a few to show, oh, look, I have got checks after all. Look, there's a photo of someone doing a check. But you're not really carrying out the level of checks needed. But then you say, so what then happens if we end up importing the aforementioned dangerous animal disease? Or it's found that there's dangerously unfit for consumption food being sold in Britain, say. Well, even a proper regime of checks doesn't reduce the risk to zero. It's not binary. It just reduced the risks down to an acceptable level, low enough that you'll mostly be fine. So the government will just claim, oh, it seems to have slipped through the net. Sorry about that. The fact that the net has holes in it the size of Rishi Sunak's bank balance seems to be neither here nor there. That's what I think is going on here. I think we've got another Brexit facade being set up. A system of checks which is getting lots of people alarmed because they go, oh, if they applied these checks, this would happen. And I'm sat there thinking, I don't think they're going to. I think it's a system of checks which won't actually be carried out as you would imagine from the published plans. After all, they never were for customs controls. So why would we imagine they will be for standards controls? That is not to say there won't be problems with the new standards controls, by the way. Certification is still required. Just as customs paperwork had created shortages, so too will standards paperwork. There will be some goods that, as a result of it, EU suppliers simply will not send to Britain. Too much hassle, too much cost. It will still impact imports. My Danish blue is still at risk. I just don't think it will end up being as serious as some people are warning, because I don't think they intend to carry out the checks in the way they are claiming. We don't have the facilities. We don't have the staff. And no government wants to see empty shelves. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.